Assalamualaikum everyone. My name is Fahd Sayed and I welcome you all to the first ever episode of Weekend Reads. The first book that we'll be covering in this series is this amazing book, Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. This is a book that I've been reading for the past few weeks and I've found it to be really interesting. Before I delve into the details of what this book is about and the things that I've covered so far, I want to share a bit why I started reading this book, and it really stemmed my interest in this book really stemmed from a very basic interest that a lot of people have, especially those in their 20s and 30s. And it's that we want to bring about a change in our lives. It's that we want to constantly improve ourselves professionally and personally. एंड उसके अंदर हम बहुत सारी चीज़ें करने की कोशिश कर रहे होते हैं अपने आप को बेहतर इंसान बनाने के लिए। और उसमें कभी कभी ऐसा होता है कि हम कोशिश करते हैं चीज़ें चेंज करने की, लेकिन हमें समझ नहीं आ रहा होता कि कहाँ से चेंज करें, अपने आप को कैसे बेहतर इंसान बनाए, हाउ डू वी ब्रिंग द बेस्ट आउट ऑफ आवर सेल्स. And the books in the first few pages of the book, it really introduces a very interesting, it shares a very interesting research that was conducted by a scholar at Duke University. And he found out that about 40% of the total actions that we do during a day, from the moment we get up to the moment we fall asleep, 40% of those actions, including waking up and falling asleep, are done by the unconscious part of your brain, which what it means is that is those 40% of the actions are done by your habit. And so if you think about it, almost half of the things that we do every single day are being dictated by the unconscious or the partially conscious part of your brain, i.e. your habits. So अगर हमें अपनी ज़िंदगी के अंदर, if you want to bring about some sort of a change, then it would make sense that that's where we should start working at. That's where we should bring about change. We should work on our habits. And now many people would say, okay, yes, we know we need to change our habits. We need to form good habits. And we also try, to get up early in the morning, go for a workout before we head for our school, colleges, or to work. And somehow the other, we just fail to make those habits permanent. Fail to convert that routine into a more sustainable long-term thing. And so why do we give up? And that's very frustrating for all of us. We commit ourselves कि यार मैंने ये चीज़ करनी है, and I have to ensure कि मैं इस पे ना consistent इस चीज़ को करूँ. 2-3 दिन, 4 दिन, एक हफ्ता, 1.5 हफ्ता हम वो करते हैं, somehow कुछ दिनों बाद हम वो छोड़ देते हैं. And so उसके लिए habits अच्छी बनाने के लिए बहुत ज़रूरी चीज़ ये है कि that we need to learn how habits form. And this is where the book really hits the nail on the head by really showing first how habits form. Once you understand how habits form, you're in a better position to deal with it. And it also shows you, it lays down a roadmap which you can follow and change your bad habits and create new good habits. So this was really the reason why I picked this book. And this is where I've this is the first thing that I wanted to read and share with my audience. The book is structured in a very interesting way. It talks about some psychological, academically dense stuff, but it also peppers it with certain case studies which make the book really interesting to read. So the way it's structured, you don't lose interest in the book, and you are always looking forward to read the next chapter. And that's really a very good quality of this author and the way they have written this book. The book basically is divided into 3 sections. The section 1 is where it talks about how habits form, how habits emerge basically in individuals. And then it also talks about how do you change bad habits. So really in the first chapter you get the thing that we all crave for, कि हम अपनी अच्छी आदतें कैसे अपनाएं, and how do we get rid of the bad ones, and how do you deal with the old habits, the old bad habits. The other thing that the second chapter covers is basically habits of organizations, of successful organizations basically. And this is really one of the most famous concepts of this book that you must have come across on internet, on social media, is the idea of keystone habit, which a lot of people in their online courses also cover about when they're talking about change management or bringing about effective change in organization. And the keystone, we'll cover that in detail later on, is basically about picking that one key habit and focusing on changing it in order to have lasting changes within the entire organization. And the last section of the book talks about habits of society, and I'm really looking forward to get into that part of the book because I come from a social science background, so I'm really interested in learning its take, seeing how it interprets how social movements succeed. And it basically takes this idea that there are certain habits that emerge due to which lead to the success of certain social movements, and it gives examples of the civil rights movement in the United States of America. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'm sure you guys are also going to be interested in listening about learning about it as well. But all of the three sections of the book and the introduction as well, it really has one key argument to it, which is that you can change habits once you understand them. And that's why this book is so quintessential, I believe, for anybody who's trying to bring about a change in their lives. So with that, let's jump into the first chapter of the book. And the first chapter of the book basically covers two key areas. The first thing it talks about is the brain structure. And the second thing it talks about is how habits form and the idea of a habit loop. And I'll cover that in a minute. So let's come to the brain structure, right? So in a basic detail, it talks about that the outer part of your brain, the upper part of your brain, that's where the complex new thinking occurs when you're learning new concepts in classes, when you're encountering new experiences and how do you make sense of that. That's usually happening in the outer layer of the brain. That's where heavy duty thinking has to happen, and it's really the conscious part of your brain. And as you move into the central and the more inner part of your brain, you reach the point where it's called the basal ganglia or basal ganglia. I hope if I'm not pronouncing right, somebody in the comment section will correct me. And this is the section where the more banal, more primitive of your behaviors are stored, right? Things like eating, things like breathing, sleeping, walking, all of those behaviors that that you do sort of automatically. That's that part of the brain, and it's sort of in the partial consciousness of the brain. You're not really conscious when you're sleeping. You're not really conscious about your breathing when you're breathing, right? So these are the things that your body does that you do automatically. So this is the part where your habits are stored. Now, whether they're good habits or whether they are bad habits, the brain doesn't differentiate that. The brain can't differentiate between that. What the brain can differentiate is whether it's something that has triggered a reward centers of the brain, and I'll cover that in a minute, or not. And if it does do that, if it fulfills that criteria, it will sort of store that into a habit and will execute it over time. And so it's a good thing and a bad thing, and we'll cover that in a minute. So once you've understood how the brain functions and where it stores the habit, let's look at the components of a habit, right? And it talks about what's known as the habit loop. Habit loop basically has three components to it. Number one is the cue. A cue is any action, any activity which acts as a stimuli to execute a certain routine or certain habit. So the brain does is when a brain studies that certain actions or a series of actions are occurring over and over again through a process what's known as chunking, it sort of chunks them quite literally together into a series and executes them whenever they see the cue. इसकी सबसे बड़ी example would be the idea of driving. So like when you learn to drive, the first few times when you're learning to drive, you're very focused. The outer part of your brain is doing the thinking. But over time, when you consistently do that, what your brain does is it stores that information, and it everything that you do from starting the car, putting the key in and starting switching on the ignition, putting on the handbrake, depending whether you're in the garage, reversing, all of those things that you do, it stores that into a habit, right? And it stores that into one series of actions. It chunks them together. And so whenever there is a cue, i.e. let's say you have to drive to work, or you have to drive to university, or you have to drive for any other reason, that's the cue that the brain receives, and automatically it cedes control to the basal ganglia. So once that habit has been formed, what it does is that it allows the basal ganglia to sort of kick in, and you're not really conscious about the act of driving when you're driving the car. You can think about a lot of things when you're driving, and the reason why you're able to do that is because driving has now sort of become like an automatic behavior. So, and the series of actions that the brain executes is basically known as the routine, which essentially is the meat part of the habit. And the last is the reward. So reward is basically the brain determining whether a certain action that we wanted to, the outcome that we wanted, whether we have received that outcome or not. And if that outcome has been received, so the brain stores that information, and over time when you continue to do that, it sort of ties the loop from the cue to the reward together, and then it knows that okay, these are the actions that when we execute these actions, we are able to get this reward. Therefore, it's important to store this information, and it forms that into a habit. So so reward in this in the example of driving is basically you being able to drive the car without crashing it. So the brain knows, okay, these are the actions that I need to execute. Start the car, put down the handbrake, put it in reverse or the first gear depending on how you park, and release the clutch. And the reason I'm giving you an example from the how to drive a manual transmission car is because that has more series of steps as compared to an auto transmission car. But you get the gist of it. That's how it functions, and that's how it it sees, okay, I can now get the car to move, and that's the reward part of your brain being lit up. It sees, okay, this is happening, it's important to store this information, I can then call back to it. So whenever there's a cue to drive, it will automatically bring about that routine and execute it, and that's how basically a habit forms or a habit emerges. And the interesting part of it is, like I said, it doesn't matter whether it's a good habit or a bad habit. The only thing the brain looks at is whether a certain reward has been achieved. And if it has been achieved, it will store that information. And the other thing is, the brain doesn't really, you aren't really conscious of a habit forming. It can happen without your consent or your conscious self knowing that this habit is forming. And the reason why it delves into a little bit of problems, we'll get back to it in a minute. So, as I said, that once you sort of, practice a habit loop over and over again, the path from the cue to the reward becomes smaller. So the brain activity that happens, so what usually happens at cue is that there's a brain activity at the cue level where it sort of cedes control to the basal ganglia, and then the brain activity sort of drops, and then until the loop is executed and the reward is received. And once you do it over and over again, the path from the cue to the reward becomes very small. And here the book really introduces an interesting case study, which is essentially an experiment that was performed on rats. So what they did was they took some rats and they put them in a maze, and at the end of the maze there was a bit of peanut butter or something that was acted as a reward. So what the rats had to do, they had to navigate through the maze to get to that reward. And so what they noticed that initially, and they were monitoring the brain activity of rats. So what they did was, initially when the rats were sort of navigating through the maze, they had higher level of brain activity because they were learning the paths of the maze and they were getting to the reward. And once they did that over and over and over again, they sort of started memorizing the path, and so they were doing that out of habit. And what was interesting, that once they had done that a few times, when they have learned the path, the brain activity of the rats actually dropped when they were going through the maze and they were getting to the reward part of it. And that's very interesting. The other thing that they noticed was the brain activity that spiked at the cue point and to the reward time also started shortening once they did it over and over again, implying that the brain was ceding control to the basal ganglia, where it wasn't really doing heavy duty thinking at that time, and allowing the habit loop to execute itself. And another thing that it's very interesting about is, another case study was about, I think they did it on monkeys, which was basically, there were multicolored levers, and one of the levers, I think it was purple colored. Once the monkeys sort of pushed that lever, they were able to, there were a few drops of their favorite juice that was trickled down into their mouths. And so what happened was, that was the reward for them. So over time they started noticing that initially, once they were doing it, there was an brain activity once they hit the liver in the reward, or i.e. the juice droplets was coming to their mouth. There was a distance between that, there was a brain activity that was happening. But over time, it got to a point where just by looking at the purple liver, because they had formed this habit, just by looking at the purple liver, which was the purple lever, which was the cue for the habit, they were able to see their reward centers light up. So initially what was happening was, there was slight brain activity at the cue point when they were pushing the purple lever, and when the juice trickled down into their mouths, there was activity noticed at their reward centers of their brain. But over time, because the habit formed just by looking at the purple lever, they were able to see brain activity in the reward centers in the reward centers of the brains of the rats. And that sort of shows that that's how habits function, right? Because a strong habit would lead to a point where just by looking at the cue or seeing the cue, you were able to witness the reward, you're able to envision the reward. And that is basically an example that a habit has taken root. So, and in a minute I'll share with you an interesting example of why you start just by the mention of the word fast food or your favorite restaurant chain. You start salivating. There's a reason for that, and that's linked to this idea as well. So this is how a basic habit forms. This is what we've learned, that this is how you can form a habit. And since the brain does not know whether it's a good habit or not, it's a double-edged sword. So let's look at the pros of forming habits and the habit loop. Number one, and perhaps the most important one, is that it helps your brain save a lot of brain power. And the reason for it is that when the experiment that we studied earlier about the rats and they were moving through the maze to get to the reward, what they noticed that over a period of time, once the rats had memorized the path when it was being executed through a habit loop, the brain activity of the rats was dropping, which showed that the brains of the rats were not really engaged in doing some heavy duty thinking. And what you can see from your own life, you can take examples from your life as well, right? So let's say you have to get up in the morning and go to your university or go to your office. Every single thing you do, from getting up, brushing your teeth, getting ready, getting into the car, driving the car, or going to the bus stop and getting the bus, all depends on how you get to your work or to your university. Imagine if every single action that you do from the moment you get up to the moment you get to your office or university or college, you had to do that with the conscious part of your brain. You had to consciously think about brushing your teeth, consciously think about driving the car, consciously think about getting ready, all of those things. By the time you would get to your desired destination, you would be very exhausted and you won't be able to do the heavy duty cognitive thinking that would be required of you when you are at your university or at your job. And that's the beauty of it. By chunking those these behaviors together, what your brain does is that it frees your mind, which is why when you're driving you can think about other things rather than just operating that vehicle. One of the things that I usually do is that when I'm going to the office during my drive, because I have a very long drive, I usually envision all the things that I have to get done within the day. What are my primary tasks? What are my major tasks that I need to close? What are the things that are pending? All of those things. And the reason my brain is able to function simultaneously, which is the second benefit of it, is because it has given it has ceded control of the driving of the car to the basal ganglia, and it frees my mind to do heavy duty thinking at the same time, and I can get more work done within the same time. But like everything, if there's a pro, there's a con to it as well. Because your habits are hardwired into your brain, it's much harder to change them. And and you can't really change them. This is another thing that the book talks about. The old habits that you have, they don't really go away, but they lurk underneath. So in order to change them, you have to form new habits, or but the old habits will always lurk underneath the surface. So you have to be very careful, and you have to dedicate a lot of conscious attention into changing a bad habit. And the other bad thing about it is the brain forms these habits without your conscious knowledge. So when you are forming a habit, you can form a habit without actively knowing that you're forming a habit. And that's a problem part. That's a bad thing about it. And the other thing is the brain really doesn't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. The only thing that the brain looks at is whether it is able to get the reward, whether the reward centers of the brain are being activated as a result of certain actions. If they are, it will form a habit over time and it will store that in the basal ganglia. And this is something that a lot of organizations use. And one of the examples that the book talks about is of McDonald's. So what McDonald's did is that every single thing from the architecture to the ambience to your customer service to the food that you're getting, every single thing is designed for expedience, designed so that you can get your food as quickly as possible. And even the fries, it talks about the fries are made in a way that they're going to disintegrate into your mouth very quickly. So let's take this scenario. This is the first time you're ever going to a McDonald's. You've never had fast food, you've never had the food before, or any fast food really. You go to the building, you look at the building, your brain stores that information. You enter the building, you experience the ambience, you interact with the staff, you place your order, you get your food, and then you have the first fry or the burger or the drink or whatever, and your reward centers light up. And you really like it, and you're like, yeah, this is something really good, I really like it, makes you feel good. So what your brain is now doing is the brain is storing all of the information, all of the things that you've done, all of the things that all of the stimuli that it has received from the external environment, and it forms it into a routine. And so what McDonald's does is, in a particular region, they go out of their way to ensure that the architecture, the ambience, and even the quality of the food, they are standards. So that just by looking at the building and just by experiencing the ambience or interacting with the customers, all of that forms a very long queue, and it sort of really pushes you towards getting to the, going into McDonald's and getting your favorite meal and eating it and having your reward centers activated. And now remember what we just studied about how when you execute a habit loop over and over again, the time from your queue to your reward actually starts shortening up, where you get to a point where just by looking at the queue, you're able to see activity, you're able to have activity in the reward centers of your brain. And this is exactly what happens when you go to a McDonald's or any of your favorite fast food chains. Just by looking at looking at the building, or the mere mention of that building, or mere mention of that place, you start salivating. And the reason why that is because you formed such a strong habit that just the cue of that, just the mention of that place acts like a cue, and you're really driven towards getting to that place. And so in one way you could say that if I have a fast food addiction, it's not really my fault, I just have formed a really bad habit of it. But here's the thing, now that you've understood how a habit forms, and this is really the crux of this chapter, once you understand how a habit forms, you can then take a conscious decision, you can take our series of actions and decisions in changing that. And this is what we'll cover in the second chapter, which will be uploaded next week, where we will discuss how new habits form and how you can change the cues or change the routines, and how you can bring about a change. So that's a very interesting chapter that you can look forward to. And now that you understand how habits form, you are now one step closer into making the changes that you need to in order to break away from the bad habits and form good ones. Stay tuned for the next chapter. Thank you, and Allah Hafiz.